Today I will be talking through some of the reasons why conflict is so common among parents and teens, as well as strategies to help reduce this conflict. I'll start off by talking about 3 processes that are common and experienced among all teens during this developmental period, but that contribute to increased family conflict, before talking about some of the difficulties that are more common among teens with ADHD that also lead to increased conflict. I'll then end by talking about some strategies that parents can use to help reduce family conflict before we open it up for questions. So as I mentioned, there are several processes that occur during the teenage years that can explain some of the reasons why we see increased parent-teen conflict during this time. The first of these processes is referred to as separation. Separation is the process of teens pulling away from their parents and their family in order to create a more independent social group. Typically, that social group consists largely or solely of their friends and peers. During the teenage years, peers have a much larger influence on the interests, activities, as well as attire that teens engage in. As a result of teens' growing autonomy, adolescents often try to gain more privacy from their parents, will often withdraw to their rooms, and communicate less with their parents about things that are going on in their daily lives, negative experiences they might be having with peers. And this separation can really lead to conflict over the teens having a reduced involvement in the family, as well as an often increase of peer activities, which can sometimes include risky behaviors or behaviors that parents aren't comfortable with, as well as conflict over how much personal information parents should have the right to know. For example, parents and teens often disagree with regard to the amount of access parents should have for things like social media accounts, text, emails, video game chats, and this is definitely something I anticipate people will have questions about. The second process is referred to as differentiation. This is the process of experimenting with one's own individuality and their identity development that often happens during the teenage years. Specifically, teens often experiment with different interests and images, including the type of activities they want to engage in, how they want to dress, all the way to things like exploring sexual identity, gender identity, to help them determine the type of person they want to be and how their various identities play a role in their life. Differentiation can lead to conflicts, particularly when teens assume identities that parents might find unfamiliar or that don't align with their own values or what they want their teen to become or how they've envisioned their teen to be growing up as they become a young adult. The third normative process that occurs during the teenage years is referred to as opposition. And opposition is simply the process of teens challenging parental authority, and this is done in an effort to become more self-determined. It's one of these things that is kind of a double-edged sword. We know that teens need to go out on their own, often starting jobs for the first time or living on their own if they go to college. And so in order to be able to become more autonomous, there's some kind of normative process where teens are going to be pushing the boundaries, challenging the limits of their parents' authority. But this can clearly lead to conflicts over parent demands, specifically when teens don't follow or in more common cases take too long to follow parental requests or rules. For example, a common one that I often hear is, parents saying how teens take way too long to get off their phone or to stop playing video games in order to do something that was asked of them, like get ready for bed, start their homework, or cleanup. So if all of those processes were not enough for explaining conflict in the teenage years, teens with ADHD have a range of additional associated or core difficulties that make conflict especially common among families of teens with ADHD. The first of these is the fact that teens with ADHD often experience difficulties with executive functions. Executive functions are responsible for many of the skills we need to be able to function successfully in day-to-day life. This includes things like paying attention, organizing, planning, and prioritizing what you need to do, being able to start tasks and stay focused on them long enough to complete them, being able to manage your time, as well as to engage in self-monitoring or the ability to keep track of what you're doing. These difficulties are often what makes completing and turning in homework so challenging, because they either forgot to write down the assignment, forgot to bring the materials that they need, or they start doing it and they get distracted. This is also, which is a common enough source of conflict, but this is also what leads to conflict often over teens not doing what parents have asked of them, either because they had difficulty initially paying attention or because of this poor self-monitoring and poor working memory, that if you've asked them to do a couple things, they might have forgotten what they were supposed to do. And so these things often lead to a lot of frustration and feelings like their kids aren't trying or that they're being disrespectful, when in reality, these underlying difficulties of executive functions are an area that typically is about 2 to 3 years behind typically developing peers without ADHD. A second reason why teens with ADHD experience higher levels of conflict, both with peers and with parents, is the fact that they have difficulty managing their emotions. Russell Barkley has described teens with ADHD as having a low frustration tolerance, impatience, and quickness to anger. Specifically, teens with ADHD are less able to moderate or suppress and kind of manage their emotional reactions they experience. This is especially true in frustrating or upsetting situations. And so teens with ADHD are more likely to show an impulsive or extreme reaction relative to other teens their age in these types of situations. These extreme reactions can often be very upsetting or embarrassing for parents and can cause additional conflict. A third reason why there's high levels of conflict among teens with ADHD is due to the significant motivational deficits teens with ADHD experience. Specifically, teens with ADHD have often had years of negative feedback from peers, from teachers, from siblings, from parents, and all of this negative feedback has often led to them feeling like no matter what they do, it's not good enough, so why even bother or why even try? And that, coupled with what we know to be an aversion to either boring or difficult tasks or tasks that require sustained attention among teens with ADHD, can really collectively contribute to why it seems like these teens are really just struggling to be motivated, struggling to get their work done. And understandably so, these motivational deficits often leave parents feeling really frustrated because they feel like their teen just doesn't care or that they're not reaching their potential. And so finding that balance of how to set realistic and achievable but still motivating goals for your teens is something that's really important. And we'll talk about some strategies for how to help encourage that and address motivational deficits in a couple minutes. The final area I want to touch on before moving to those strategies that is often a source of conflict and hard for parents of teens with ADHD to address is the fact that teens with ADHD are at risk for engaging in various risk-taking and risky behaviors, such as alcohol and other substance use. Additionally, because of difficulties both with impulse control and emotion regulation, they have higher rates of risky behaviors, as well as poor decision-making. One of the reasons why this can be challenging is that we know teens with ADHD often have difficulty making as well as keeping friends. And so it's challenging for parents often to find this balance between encouraging peer interactions among their teens with ADHD while still appropriately setting limits, as well as trying to prevent engagement in these various risky behaviors. So now that you hopefully have a little bit more of a sense of why teens with ADHD experience so much conflict, particularly with parents, but also with peers and others, I want to talk through some strategies to help reduce this conflict. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we know teens with ADHD get a lot of negative feedback and have often had many experiences with failures. So one of the strategies that we encourage parents to do to help with motivation, as well as to reduce conflict, is to acknowledge and appreciate steps that are in the right direction of the outcome you want, not just a successful final outcome. So an example of this would be, if your child has 20 missed assignments, 10 missed assignments, rather than only reinforcing when they have completed all of those late assignments for partial credit, or maybe because of a 504 plan, they're able to turn them in late still for full credit. You want to be providing reinforcement of, I know this was a lot. I'm so proud of you for getting those first couple done. Let's keep talking through ways to help you get these done, because I know it can feel overwhelming when you have gotten behind. So you really want to focus on and complement your teen's efforts rather than the outcome. Because one of the things we know is that because of often comorbid difficulties with learning, that sometimes teens with ADHD can try really, really hard, and the outcome still might not be what you hope for, what you want. But if you know that they've tried their best, they've put their effort, you really want to focus on and complement that. The other helpful hint to kind of remember this, focusing on approximations or steps in the right direction, is to go by the simple rule of trying to provide 3 positive points of feedback or comments for every 1 negative point of feedback you get. The reason why this is so important is that we as human beings are evolutionarily attuned to attend to negative things. So when something has gone wrong, we want to put out that fire, and we often provide a lot of attention to that. So if you ask your teen to do something and they go and do it, you often aren't going to attend to that of, thank you for listening the first time, or thank you for helping me bring in the groceries. That's a big help. You often comment on the time when they're not doing what you want, or when there's that negative behavior. And so especially among teens with ADHD, they're getting berated with all these negative comments. And so we want to be focusing on when they are doing the things we want, especially, or approximating. So maybe they remembered to bring in the groceries, but they put them down as soon as they entered in the door rather than bringing them into the kitchen. So you can still say, thank you so much for bringing the groceries into the house. It was a really big help. Would you mind helping me now bring these in to the house or into the kitchen? And so you still want to acknowledge their efforts rather than just saying, why did you leave the groceries in the front of the house? And getting upset that they didn't do what you wanted. Related to this point, one of the kind of phrases that I kind of live by and encourage parents to live by is pick your battles. This couldn't be more true than right now during COVID, when families are spending so much time together. If you are attending to all of the small little annoyances, those eye rolls, those sighs, you are going to be setting yourself up for constantly being annoyed, constantly being frustrated, and likewise your teen being really frustrated that you're always nitpicking on them. And so really trying to comment on those negative behaviors when they are bigger things. That could be And that could be different for each family. For some, it's swearing. For some, it's yelling. For some, it's only when they get physical. For others, it might be smaller things, like if they're stomping up and down the stairs. I've heard some parents who that doesn't bother them, others who that's totally not acceptable. A second general strategy that will really help reduce conflict is trying to provide opportunities for your teen to feel like they have a sense of autonomy and that they're becoming more self-determined by providing them with opportunities to have choices and control. This can be small things like letting your teen decide what will be for dinner or the order that they have to complete their chores on a weekend. Using forced choices like, would you rather help me bring the groceries in or help your dad mow the lawn? And giving this control and choices to your teens will make the commands that you do give or the things that you're telling them they have to do and there isn't an option a lot easier to take in, rather than the teen feeling like I'm always being told what to do all the time. Related to giving these commands, so when there are things that have to happen and are not optional or you can't really give control, it's really important that when you're giving these commands that you're doing so in a firm and calm manner. Sometimes our natural instinct is to just increase the volume because we think that that'll make them listen or that'll make them comply. And in reality, increasing the volume doesn't work and oftentimes can just escalate the situation and make your teen upset. And it's also modeling anger as well as dysregulation, which is negative, which is not going to be helpful for your teen being able to learn their own emotion regulation strategies. One of the things that often leads to conflict among teens and their parents is teens feeling like their parents are being unfair. I'm sure you've all heard the word unfair way more times than you can count. And when teens say this, parents often feel like the teen's being disrespectful, and it kind of becomes this back and forth, really frustration, mutual frustration. And so there's a couple general strategies that can help parents and teens feel like the situations are more fair and that it's clear what's being expected. So the first of these is making sure that you're providing consistent expectations so that the teen knows what to expect of them. One of the big things related to this is you want to make sure that your reinforcement, either positive or negative, for behaviors or misbehaviors, are consistent with what is being expected. So just as you wouldn't give, a trip to Disney World because your teen got A's on a report card, a teen shouldn't be grounded because they missed curfew or lied one time. You want to focus on smaller, more immediate responses, both positive and negative. What oftentimes happens, though, particularly in response to negative behaviors, is that parents can act out of anger. And this can lead to giving bigger punishments, such as no electronics for a month or being grounded for 3 months. And these type of large punishments, while they might feel like this was a really big misbehavior, what it can actually cause is what we refer to as a downward spiral, where you've already taken away this really big privilege, and so you have to keep taking away other smaller things or other privileges until there's truly nothing left for the teen to lose. And then they feel like they feel like no matter what they do, there's no point of trying. They can't get what they want, and it really leads to no motivation as well as more misbehavior. And so that's why having smaller, more immediate punishments can be just as, if not more effective. Specifically, it can lead to improving behavior because the teens feel like, tomorrow is a new day and that they can be set up for success, or, next week is a new week if it's a little bit longer. But this also reduces conflict because I'm sure you've all had experiences with your teens kind of negotiating to earn privileges back or be able to get things back that they've lost. One of the final things related to this, and this is a really important one that's easier said than done, is that once a privilege has been earned, it can't be taken away, no matter how bad a misbehavior is that occurs. So I'm going to give an example. So if your teen has earned the opportunity to go somewhere special with a friend over the weekend, maybe because they got good grades or they helped out around the house, whatever you had set up, even if your teen engages in a serious behavior on Thursday or Friday, kind of right before when that special event was going to happen, that special trip cannot be taken away as a punishment. Instead, another privilege, such as electronics, should be taken away instead, because otherwise, teens start to learn that they can't trust you at your word, that when they do something good and have earned something, that it can still be taken away. And that really leads to this feelings of things being unfair, as well as increases in conflict. The last point I want to touch on before we open it up for questions is to talk about how to avoid power struggles. So first and foremost, if your goal during a conflict with your teen is to win control of the situation, then I would say you've already lost. When we shift the focus during a conflict from the disagreement itself and what led to that to proving who is in charge of the outcome, this is a power struggle. And this shift results in a missed opportunity for emotional development, conflict management skills, as well as parent-teen relationship development. So 3 strategies to help avoid these power struggles are to really remember that conflict between any 2 people arises because those 2 people have different sets of thoughts and emotions about that same issue. And so as a parent, it's really important that you try to understand your teen's emotions and thoughts that might be underlying the behavior. You might not agree with the behavior, you might not think that it was an appropriate behavior, but showing empathy and understanding for why they did what they did or acted the way they did can really help reduce this butting of heads or this power struggle. Related to this, by being able to focus on the reason for the conflict or the reason for the issue, why the teen did what they did, it can allow you and your teen to help your teen build problem-solving skills and be able to learn how to come up with solutions and compromises to address a situation. And this is a really critical skill that they're going to need in their own lives with their peers, when they go off to college, if they have a future partner, or when they're in a job, being able to critically manage and in a calm way conflicts. Additionally, while we know disagreements and conflicts are a natural part of life, it's important that we can help our teens be able to respectfully assert themselves and to successfully resolve conflicts peacefully. So one of the things that can be helpful with this is that when possible, we want to try to recognize when a problem might arise and figure out what to say or do to avoid that problem from continuing to reoccur in the future. The reason why this can be helpful is it's easier to address conflicts not in the heat of a moment. So if you just had this argument, we often want to try to resolve it as quickly as possible, but we also want to try to resolve it as helpfully and peacefully as possible so this doesn't occur again. And so trying to address a conflict at the peak of the disagreement often only results in escalation and more hurt feelings. Instead, giving both parties time to calm down and address the issue when you both have had some time to think about it, reflect on your behaviors, and are more calmly able to engage in a discussion can really help your teen be able to develop these important emotion regulation and conflict management skills. One of the simple strategies that I'll throw out now related to this is encouraging your teens as well as yourself to engage in what we call coping skills. Coping skills are any behavior that can help you feel better, that are not harmful to yourself or to someone else. Some common coping skills are things like talking to someone like a friend, exercising, such as going for a walk or run, listening to music, drawing or writing in a journal, taking a nice hot shower or bath, taking some time and space, such as going to your room to calm down. This could involve taking some deep breaths or practicing mindfulness. By giving yourself that space and time to have an opportunity to calm down and collect your thoughts can make your discussion a lot more effective and help prevent future conflict. I just want to make you aware on this slide are many resources related to some of the topics that I was touching on.
One participant asked Dr. Breaux, do you have any advice on turning around the negativity, particularly victimization or a teen's position of the world is working against me?
Yeah, that's a challenging one because often our gut instinct is to kind of say, that's not true, or kind of focus on the times when they've been successful or that you're not working against them. And while there's probably a lot of truth to that, it's really critical to try to understand why your teen is expressing that type of thing. So you can always reflect back what they're saying. So it seems like you're feeling like everyone's against you and that things aren't going your way. Can you tell me what makes you say that? And kind of give them the opportunity to explain the things that have happened. It often opens the ground for them feeling like that they're heard and that you're going to listen and be supportive, rather than, as very well-meaning and well-intentioned parents, we often jump to trying to solve the problem or make the child feel better. But sometimes we just want to be validated that these things aren't going well, and there might be a particular thing that has occurred multiple times or that might be driving that statement. And by opening up the ground for them to be able to say what happened that led to that comment, it can provide the framework for them being able to engage in that problem solving, that discussion.
Thank you. Another participant asked, how do you effectively motivate the following through on tasks?
Yeah, so there's no one answer for that. Some of that, especially with teens, so with younger kids, we often talk about, focus on one thing at a time, provide reinforcement after that one thing. As teens get older, we kind of hope that they're going to be able to remember to do a couple things or not have to be monitored constantly. And so I often will have conversations of like, what gets in the way, or why do you think you're not able to complete these tasks? Is it that they're getting distracted by their phone? Is it that they're getting distracted by siblings, noises going on in the house? Is it that it's too hard and they actually need the help? So trying to understand, and some of that also ties into the comments I was making earlier about really trying to provide support and acknowledgement for when they are approximating. So say they typically just don't do their homework at all unless you're hovering over them the whole time. If they're set them up for success and say, all right, so you really like history. It looks like you have to read this chapter. Why don't you get started on that? I'll check back in a little bit and see how that goes. And say they got halfway through. They didn't finish the whole thing. You can still say, well, that's great that you were able to get started. I'm really proud of you. What happened that you weren't able to? Can I be helpful? And maybe it's that it was too difficult for them to understand. Maybe they got bored of it because it was dull, drying history. Maybe it was that they were thinking about something that happened earlier that day. And so trying to understand and then set up systems to reduce distractions, or seeing, do they want you to check in or not? Sometimes helping a system of like, you're going to be working at the dining room table rather than in your room, because we know that having your phone or the video games is going to be too distracting.
Thank you. Another participant asked, do you have special or specific advice when the mom also has ADD/ADHD?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a general answer and then I guess speak a little bit more directly to your question. So one of the things, regardless of if the parent has ADD or ADHD themselves, is everyone messes up sometimes. And so that can be especially true if you're someone who also struggles with paying attention, follow through, organization, managing your emotions. And so for all parents, I think it's actually a really good thing to model that we're all human, we all make mistakes. And so if you reacted out of anger and got upset or feel like you had too large of a reaction, it's okay to say, I'm sorry that I yelled at you. I've had a really stressful day. Hearing that was upsetting for me, but it wasn't okay for me to raise my voice and yell. And what that's communicating is that emotions are okay and we can have reactions, and that we all make mistakes and we can learn from those and that we're trying to do better. Where that can be particularly challenging, though, less related to the emotion regulation piece, is with the organizational piece. And so what I would say is, trying to figure out where your specific difficulties are. I often hear it brought up in terms of the organizational piece, and the teen blames the parent because the parent didn't remind them that they had to do something. And then vice versa, because the parent feels like the teen should be able to do it. And so just thinking through, what is your support system that you need? For some people, it's setting reminders and alarms on their phone so that they're remembering the things they have to do, like making sure that their teen takes their medication, or what day of the week, pickups need to happen. And so that's where, depending on each parent, knowing kind of what areas you struggle the most with and what support is going to be helpful for you.
Okay, one participant asked, do you have any advice on how to manage the balance between letting her son spend time with friends and preventing risky behavior? What boundaries, you mentioned boundaries in your presentation, so what boundaries would you specifically say in a scenario like this?
So I don't think I can tell any one family, these are the boundaries or these are what you have to do, because I think each family has their own, what we said is acceptable and their way of handling it. And so some of that is being able to have an open conversation around, concerns you have, why it's important for you to know certain things. And sometimes that comes down to trust as well, and communicating, I'm going to trust you until you break that trust, or if they already have broken it, this is why I need to know these things, and kind of setting up what you think's realistic. If that is, I need to know who you're with, or I need you to text me when you're there or call me when you're there so that you can check in. Figuring out ways that are going to allow them to engage in those, talking about some of these risky behaviors, substance use, that's becoming increasingly common among teens, in a way that feels true to you. We know that not talking about it or encouraging abstinence, be it from sexual activity, substance use, is not an effective way to prevent these things from happening. And so really talking about how we can make sure that your teens are staying safe. And when you have concerns about certain friends or certain places, particularly, in these uncertain times, if they're going somewhere or engaging with someone who you're worried about, expressing why that is.
Okay, another participant asked, do you see a big difference between how a parent would handle these conflicts in a younger teen, say 13 to 14, versus an older teen, say 17, 18?
I think that's a really good question. And my initial instinct is yes. And largely that's because we want to shape it based off of cognitively and emotionally how these kids are going to be able to handle it. And so younger teens are going to still need a lot more scaffolding and support than older teens. I think our natural instinct is we assume, teens can manage their behaviors, manage their emotions on their own. And we know that's definitely not the case for teens with ADHD. So with younger teens, like those 13, 14, 15-year-olds, you might need to be providing some of those suggestions for, it seems like this might be the problem. Do you think that this, or this might help with that? Rather than saying like, well, what do you think we can do about it? That might still be true as teens get older, but the hope is that as you provide more structure for kind of modeling how to problem solve, how to address these issues, trying them out and seeing how they worked, having conversations about that afterwards. As they get older, they're going to be able to do this more and more on their own. And the hope is always that, by the time they're in adulthood, going to college, having a job, that they're going to be able to do this largely on their own. Although I'm sure all of us can think of times where we as adults have had to call a friend, talk through an issue, or try to figure out what to do. And so communicating that that's actually a positive thing to do is a way to make them feel like they don't have to deal with this all on their own, even as they're 17, 18, 20 years old.
Okay, another parent has a question about conflict among siblings. So how do you address conflict between siblings who are experiencing other disabilities? So one child has ADHD, another child has another disability. The example listed is ASD or other related disorders.
Yeah, and this can be challenging because related to that point I was making about teens feeling like things are unfair, I hear that a lot where parents are saying, my kids don't understand why so-and-so doesn't have to do what the other sibling has to do. And so that's where I go back to, in a developmentally appropriate way and in a way that you feel comfortable, explaining that you're each working on your own things, you each have your own strengths and weaknesses. And so I have expectations that are based off of that for each of you, and you each get consequences, both positive and negative, based off of your specific abilities. The other big thing that can come up there is making it clear that just because you don't see the consequence or what happens does not mean that I've not handled it. Because there's often this feeling of like, because you're expecting the sibling with ASD or the sibling with ADHD to have that meltdown, and you might respond differently when they have a meltdown versus when a sibling without a disability has the meltdown, that you don't want to have the sibling without the difficulties feel like, oh, well, they're getting special treatment or you go easier on them. And so that really goes back to my point about making sure that you're providing positive feedback for all of the siblings. The actual feedback you give might be different, the attention to the positive, but that you're not falling into that trap that because your child with ADHD or your child with ASD had this negative thing happen, that you're spending hours and hours addressing that. Because then what's being reinforced is that when negative things happen, be they conflict, be they academic, that's how I get parent attention.
Okay, perfect. I think we have 2 more questions and we'll wrap up for the evening. The first is being asked by a school counselor. She's asking, do you have any suggestions as to a format or a modality to help educate parents and teachers on how to reinforce the ideas in school with the student?
Yeah, so Ross Green has some really good resources publicly available on his website, Life's in Balance, that kind of talk about this collaborative approach to addressing issues. I think that's a really good one. The other bigger kind of research framework is kind of related to 2 areas. One is the emotion socialization literature. So there's a lot of work that talks about how parents and teachers discuss emotions as well as model emotions and react to emotions can help influence how a child is or teen is able to regulate their emotions and deal with kind of frustration and conflictual situations. And so there's some good work there, both for parents and teens, parents and teachers. The other piece that just comes to mind is the motivational interviewing literature. And so the first intervention that I know has been talked about by Maggie Sibley through some of the CHAD webinars as well as publications is actually an intervention that targets kind of the underlying executive functions, organization difficulties, but uses a motivational interviewing framework to understand why these difficulties are happening. They use contracts between parents and teens to be able to address the areas of difficulty. The relax handouts that I included on the resources, that's the intervention that that I developed and am currently evaluating, has some handouts available on the website for how parents and teens can identify what the conflict was, what the different perspectives were. And I think that could be used by teachers or counselors in schools as well, because there's often peer conflict or conflict between a teacher and an adolescent. And the way that that's done through Relax is the parent and the teen independently identify what the conflict was, what their perspective was, and then they try to think about what the perspective of the other person was, and then they discuss it, try to identify solutions. And so I think that could easily be modified to work with two peers or a teacher and a student, and obviously is meant to work for parents and teens. And that could also work with sibling conflict, going back to that prior question.
Perfect, thank you. And then our last question to close out the broadcast is about regressive behavior. So it's a two-part. The first is, how common is it for children with ADHD to show regressive behavior? And is there anything to do to help them? The parent lists two examples for regressive behavior, such as acting younger or more immature than they normally would, or what you would normally expect.
Yeah, so a lot of the times when we see kind of regressive behavior or what we think is immature behavior, our reaction is often to try to minimize that or reduce that. This is really fitting into that emotion socialization literature that I was mentioning a moment ago. And so my reaction is that we want to try to understand where that's coming from. Sometimes it's because the teen does not have the emotional capacity to be able to deal with it. And so, or the cognitive or vocabulary capacity to be able to communicate what's happening. And so that's what's leading to it. Other times, and I think this happens a little bit more often, is that it's because it's a way to get attention. And one of the kind of founding principles that we talk about a lot with younger kids with ADHD, but is just as true with teens and adults, is that if we can't get positive attention, we will settle for negative attention. And so if they've learned that they're able to get your attention, be able to have their needs met by engaging in these very unacceptable behaviors, they're going to keep engaging in them. And so trying to understand, is it that they're feeling like this is their only way of doing it, providing opportunities for them to discuss things when they're not in that silly or kind of babyish moment is really critical. I think that would be one of my big takeaways is, as much as we can try to foresee when there are going to be issues and talk through and help them problem solve them before they happen, it's easier then to follow up when things don't go as well or they are upset. Because in the moment when they're acting silly and babyish like that, it's going to be really hard to have a meaningful conversation with them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, everyone, this is all the time we have for our webinar this evening. I would like to thank you, Dr. Breaux, for a wonderful presentation and for staying on to answer our participants' questions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes today's webcast. Have a good evening.